Push your palm against the surface in front of you. A wall, a desk, the arm of a chair, anything solid. Push for 3 seconds. Feel the load travel through your wrist, up your forearm, through your elbow into your upper arm, and arrive at your shoulder. 3 seconds. You can stop now. Bones in your forearm just received more compressive loading in those 3 seconds than they received during your entire morning walk. The walk loaded your legs 1 to 1.5 times your body weight through the calcaneus, the tibia, and the femur with every step. The piezoelectric signals the heel drops discussion described fired through the lower skeleton with each ground contact. The lower half of your skeleton is maintained by walking. Every step maintains it. Every stair maintains it. Your upper skeleton received nothing. The radius, the ulna, the humerus, the 27 bones of each wrist and hand, the scapulae, none of them crossed the osteocyte activation threshold during the walk. They have not crossed it in decades. The arms swung freely at your sides throughout the walk. The motion was pendular, driven by the rotational momentum of the torso, requiring almost no muscular force and producing zero skeletal loading. The bones were passengers during the walk, not participants. Everything the upper body does during a typical day falls below the threshold. Typing 2 to 5 newtons per keystroke. Lifting a coffee cup 10 to 15 newtons. Holding a phone 8 to 12 newtons. Turning a door handle 5 to 10 newtons. The wall push delivers 200 to 280 newtons per arm. The gap between what the upper skeleton receives and what it requires is not a matter of degree. It is the difference between a signal and silence, between forces that register on the osteocyte network and forces so small the osteocytes do not detect them at all. A molecular switch that determines whether bone is built or resorbed, the mechanism that explains why 30 seconds against a wall produces hours of bone-building activation, is the physics the second half reaches after establishing what the absence has cost. Pushing disappeared from modern life within 2 generations. The force that once arrived daily from climbing, from bracing against surfaces, from pushing heavy objects, from bearing weight through the arms during millions of years of primate locomotion, gone and never replaced. The lower skeleton kept its signal through walking. The upper skeleton lost its signal entirely and has been losing density at 1 to 2% per year ever since. Walking builds bone from the pelvis down, and only from the pelvis down. Wolff's law specific. Each bone remodels along the lines of stress applied to that specific bone. It responds to its own local mechanical environment and remains indifferent to loading elsewhere in the skeleton. The compressive forces traveling through the tibia during a morning walk do not propagate to the humerus. No tendon connects the leg bones to the arm bones. No joint transmits force between them. No fascial chain carries the compressive load from the lower limb to the upper. The mechanical isolation is absolute. The upper and lower halves of the skeleton operate as independent loading environments connected by the pelvis and spine, but sharing no compressive force pathway during walking. This isolation means every bone maintains its density independently. The femur responds to the forces applied to the femur. The tibia responds to the forces applied to the tibia. The radius responds to the forces applied to the radius. And if no forces are applied to the radius loses density regardless of how vigorously the femur is being loaded by walking. The mechanotransduction signals in the femoral cortex operate entirely locally, activating bone formation in the femur and nowhere else. Each bone's osteocyte network detects only the forces applied to its own matrix and responds only to deformation that crosses approximately 1,000 to 1,500 microstrain, the minimum required for the mechanosensitive channels to open and initiate the signaling cascade. During walking, the upper limb skeleton receives approximately 0 microstrain. The arms swing passively, a pendular motion generating no compressive loading approaching the threshold. The forces the upper skeleton encounters daily fall 20 to 100 times below what the wall push delivers, a categorical absence, not a deficit. You can feel the isolation in your own body. Walk for 5 minutes and then stop. Your calves are warm, blood flowing through muscles that just contracted thousands of times. Your thighs register the effort, but your forearms feel nothing. Your wrists feel nothing. Your upper arms carried no load during the walk and received no signal from it. The warmth in the legs and the silence in the arms is the asymmetry reporting through the medium your body uses to communicate mechanical demand, blood flow to working tissue. 5 of 7 mechanical inputs the skeleton evolved to receive daily have disappeared from modern life, as the 7 movements framework described. The pushing vector is one of the 5. For millions of years, the upper limbs bore compressive loads daily. Climbing vertical surfaces loaded the radius and ulna in compression. Overhead reaching loaded the scapulae through the serratus anterior bracing against the rib cage. Pushing loaded the humateria against fallen trees, against rock, against soil during digging, against any surface that resisted movement. The loads were not extreme, they were moderate and sustained. The kind of loading that crosses the osteocyte threshold without exceeding the soft tissue tolerance. Exactly the kind the wall push replicates. Early hominids retained upper body loading through tool use, construction, and agriculture. A person building a stone wall in 1800 bore compressive loads through the radius with every stone placed. A person kneading bread bore loading through the metacarpals and carpals with every push into the dough. A person pumping water bore loading through the entire arm from wrist to shoulder. The elimination happened in the last 50 to 70 years: desk work, automotive transport, mechanized agriculture, and power tools removing the last sources of upper body compressive loading from the average adult's day. 2 generations. The skeleton did not change, but the environment changed around it. Lower body bones adapted to bipedal walking and continue to receive adequate mechanotransduction. The upper skeleton never adapted to receive nothing. The osteocyte network in the radius and humerus maintains the mechanosensory apparatus it always maintained. The channels, the ion channels, the sclerostin gene, the entire molecular machinery waiting for a signal that stopped arriving. The bones respond when loaded and lose density when unloaded. The biology has not changed. Only the loading environment has. DEXA scans in adults over 60 reveal the asymmetry in numbers. The femoral neck, loaded thousands of times daily by every step, routinely shows T-scores significantly better than the distal radius in the same patient. A T-score of -0.5 at the hip alongside -1.8 at the wrist is not unusual. It is the expected result of a skeleton that received loading on one half and silence on the other for 30 years. If you have had a DEXA scan, the report contains both measurements. Most physicians focus on the femoral neck and the lumbar spine, the sites where fractures carry the highest morbidity and mortality. The distal radius measurement is on that report, often on the second page, and it is rarely discussed in that conversation. But the number is there, and in a person who walks regularly but performs no upper body resistance loading, the distal radius T-score is almost always worse than the femoral neck. The skeleton is telling you which bones heard the signal and which did not. Femoral neck maintained its density through thousands of daily loading cycles, each step generating 1 to 1.5 times body weight in compressive force through a bone evolved to receive exactly that magnitude. The distal radius lost its density because nothing in your daily life crossed the 1,000 microstrain threshold in the forearm bones. Well, the distal radius is the bone most commonly fractured in adults over 55. Canis and colleagues documented this in Osteoporosis International, the most frequent fracture in postmenopausal women worldwide, the second most frequent in men over 60. The fracture happens during a fall onto an outstretched hand. The reflex is universal. The arm extends to catch the body before the head strikes the ground. It fires faster than conscious thought. The vestibular system detects the fall, the motor cortex commands arm extension, and the hand reaches the ground before the person has time to decide whether catching themselves is wise. Ground reaction force arrives at the palm at approximately 3 to 5 times body weight, a 70-kilogram person hitting the ground with 200 to 350 kilograms of instantaneous force compressed into the heel of one hand. The force travels through the carpal arch and into the distal radius at the metaphyseal region, the transition zone where the dense cortical shaft gives way to the spongy trabecular interior. This is the weakest structural point in the radius, and it is the point where the fracture occurs in the overwhelming majority of cases. The bone fails because no loading in the preceding decades prepared the trabecular lattice for sudden impact. The lattice that should have been thick and interconnected, ready to absorb and distribute the force across the full cross-section, is sparse, thin, and disconnected from decades of zero input. Bone that has been regularly loaded maintains the architecture to absorb sudden force. The trabecular lattice stays thick and interconnected. Cross struts link the vertical columns in a three-dimensional mesh, each strut distributing impact force to its neighbors, each neighbor distributing to theirs, until the force spreads across the full cross-section of the bone. The architecture is not random. It follows the loading history. Struts grow thicker along the lines of compression the bone has experienced, and thinner along lines that receive less stress. A radius that has been pushed against surfaces for years has trabecular struts aligned to resist exactly the compressive force a fall would deliver. The cortical shell maintains its thickness through the same mechanism, the osteocytes on the inner and outer bone surfaces detecting the loading and maintaining the shell geometry that resists bending. Bone that has received no loading has none of this structural preparation. The trabecular lattice thins across decades of zero input. Individual trabeculae narrow from surface resorption. Eventually they perforate, the cross-section thinning past the structural minimum until the strut breaks. Once a trabecula perforates, it is lost permanently. Osteoblasts need a surface to deposit on. A disconnected fragment provides none. The lattice becomes sparse, the connections lost, the mesh that should distribute impact force reduced to isolated pillars that fail individually rather than sharing the load collectively. Cortical shell narrows through endostele resorption, the inner surface dissolving while the outer expands slightly. The result is a thinner-walled tube of larger diameter. This geometry is weaker in bending. The structural engineering is straightforward. A thin-walled pipe bends more easily than a thick-walled pipe of smaller diameter. The distal radius fracture is the predictable failure of a structure that never received its maintenance signal. The afternoon I compared my DEXA scan, I understood the asymmetry in my own skeleton. Femoral neck, -0.4, normal for a man in his 50s who walks daily. Distal radius, -1.6, solidly osteopenic. The legs were maintained. The arms were not. The walking I trusted to protect my bones had been protecting half of them. You know the absence and what it costs at the distal radius. The question changes from what the push replaces to what happens at the molecular level when the push arrives. Because 30 seconds against a wall does not merely apply force, it triggers a biochemical switch inside the osteocyte network, a switch that suppresses the protein keeping bone formation turned off and remains flipped for hours after the contact ends. Now, when the palms press against the wall, the loading deforms the bone matrix by 1,000 to 2,000 microstring. The deformation is invisible to the eye and imperceptible to sensation. Approximately 1/10 of a millimeter across a 10-centimeter segment of radius. But the osteocytes detected with extraordinary precision. These cells are embedded throughout the bone matrix at densities of 15,000 to 20,000 per cubic millimeter, the most abundant cells in bone tissue, each one sitting in a tiny cavity called a lacuna and extending long cellular processes through microscopic channels called canaliculi that connect it to its neighbors and to the bone surfaces. Deformation drives interstitial fluid through this lacuna canalicular network. The channels are 200 to 300 nanometers in diameter, far too narrow to see without an electron microscope, but wide enough for the interstitial fluid to flow through under the pressure gradients the bone deformation creates. The fluid generates shear stress of 8 to 30 dyne per square centimeter on the osteocyte cell membranes, as Klein-Newland and colleagues established in Bone. This shear stress is the signal the osteocyte detects, not the compression itself, not the deformation of the bone matrix directly, the fluid flowing past its membrane, the drag force of interstitial fluid moving through a channel narrower than a human hair. Mechanosensitive ion channels in the osteocyte membrane respond to this fluid drag. Piezo 1 detects membrane stretch. TRPV4 detects osmotic changes in the fluid environment. Both open when the membrane deforms under the shear stress, allowing calcium ions to flood into the cell at concentrations that trigger the intracellular signaling cascade within seconds. Prostaglandin E2 releases from the osteocyte membrane, amplifying the mechanical detection across the local network. Nitric oxide is produced by the osteocyte's own synthase, an identical molecule to what endothelial cells produce in response to vascular shear stress, serving a parallel function, signaling that mechanical force is present. And, the critical step, sclerostin is downregulated. Sclerostin is a glycoprotein that osteocytes produce continuously in unloaded bone. It functions as a molecular brake on bone formation, and the break exists for a reason the body considers important. Building bone is metabolically expensive. Every gram of new bone requires calcium extracted from the bloodstream, phosphate diverted from energy metabolism, and collagen synthesized by osteoblasts consuming glucose and oxygen at high rates. The body does not invest in structural maintenance where no structural demand exists. Sclerostin is the mechanism that enforces this efficiency. It tells the osteoblasts not to build where the bone is not being used. Sclerostin binds to the LRP5 and LRP6 receptors on osteoblast precursor cells. These are the Wnt signaling receptors that control cell differentiation throughout the body. When sclerostin occupies them, the Wnt pathway is blocked. The precursor cells cannot differentiate into active, mineral-depositing osteoblasts. The formation machinery sits idle. In unloaded bone, sclerostin keeps this formation turned off permanently. Osteoclast resorption continues on its own schedule, removing old bone, releasing calcium into the bloodstream, maintaining the metabolic calcium reserve the body draws on for nerve conduction, muscle contraction, and cardiac rhythm. But the formation side is suppressed. The balance tips irreversibly toward net loss. The osteoclasts keep working. The osteoblasts wait for a signal that in the upper skeleton has not arrived in years. When loading arrives, sclerostin production drops within minutes. The gene downregulates. The existing sclerostin in the extracellular space clears through normal protein turnover. The LRP receptors on osteoblast precursors are freed. The Wnt pathway activates. Precursor cells differentiate into mature osteoblasts capable of depositing new mineral along the collagen scaffolding they secrete. New bone deposits along the compression lines runching bone equilibrium. The deposition follows the stress map. Surfaces that receive more force receive more mineral, surfaces that receive less. The bone reinforces itself against exactly the force vector the push delivered. Suppression outlasts the stimulus by hours. Roebling and colleagues demonstrated this in the Journal of Bone and Mineral Research. 30 seconds of sustained loading produces measurably greater sclerostin downregulation than equivalent force in brief bursts. A 5-second push starts the cascade but does not complete it. 30 seconds completes it. The bone-building window remains open for the remainder of the morning. And then, the wall push activates a stabilization chain in the shoulder that no other common daily activity replicates. Compressive force through the arms loads the glenohumeral joint anteriorly, and the rotator cuff must stabilize against it. The four muscles, supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, subscapularis, co-contract to center the humeral head in the glenoid socket. This co-contraction is categorically different from the movements the shoulder performs during daily life. Reaching for a shelf uses one or two rotator cuff muscles at a time. Turning a steering wheel uses a different subset. The wall push demands all four simultaneously, the specific loading pattern that maintains the integrity of the cuff as a unit. Rotator cuff tears affect approximately 40% of adults over 60, as Yamamoto and colleagues published in the Journal of Shoulder and Elbow Surgery. The tears begin with weakening from disuse, the muscles losing the co-contraction capacity that only sustained stabilization loading maintains. The wall push provides that loading. And then, the scapula receives its own loading. The scapula is unique among bones. It has no bony joint with the thorax. It is held against the rib cage entirely by muscular attachments, the serratus anterior pressing it forward, the trapezius and rhomboids pulling it backward, the levator scapulae suspending it from above. The serratus anterior contracts forcefully during the wall push to protract the scapula against resistance. This compresses the scapula against the ribs, providing bone-to-bone contact forces the scapula almost never receives during desk-based life. Serratus weakness produces the medial winging visible in many adults over 50 pay, the inner border of the shoulder blade, lifting away from the rib cage, destabilizing every movement the shoulder attempts. Multiple age-related declines converge on the upper skeleton after 50. Osteoblast responsiveness to mechanical signals decreases. An identical loading magnitude that triggered robust formation at 30 produces a weaker response at 60. The mechanosensitive channels require stronger stimulus. The sclerostin suppression needs more sustained input. The threshold for formation rises while the capacity to generate force decreases from sarcopenia, operating on a parallel timeline. In women, declining oestrogen after menopause removes the hormonal brake on osteoclast activity. Resorption accelerates while formation slows. The upper skeleton loses density faster from unopposed resorption. The lower skeleton partially counteracts through walking-derived mechanotransduction. The upper skeleton has no countermeasure. In men, the decline is slower but real. Testosterone drops at 1 to 2% per year after 30, reducing the androgenic brake on osteoclast recruitment. The acceleration arrives roughly a decade later, but follows an identical trajectory. The upper body bones have no mechanical reserve to buffer either hormonal shift. Neither sex is protected without the push. Declining vitamin D synthesis reduces calcium absorption from the gut. After 50, the skin produces less vitamin D3 per hour of sun exposure, and the average adult over 60 spends less time in direct sunlight than the average adult at 30. Less vitamin D means less calcium crosses the intestinal wall. Less available calcium means less raw material for the osteoblasts. Even when the sclerostin suppression from the push frees them to build, they cannot deposit mineral they do not have access to. The push generates the signal. The vitamin D determines whether the signal has material to work with. A wall push with adequate vitamin D builds bone. A wall push with insufficient vitamin D generates the signal without the supply. Declining muscle mass reduces the force to push generates. Sarcopenia, the age-related loss of skeletal muscle, reduces maximum push force at approximately 1 to 2% per year after 50. The rate matches the bone density decline almost exactly. Each year the muscles produce slightly less force while the bones require slightly more force to reach the rising threshold. The push that generated 1500 microstrain at 50 generates 1200 at 60 and 900 at 70. Unless the progression protocol increases the lean angle or shifts to one-arm loading to compensate for the declining force output. The convergence tightens every decade, weaker muscles producing less stimulus for more fragile bones through less responsive osteocytes with less calcium under reduced hormonal protection. Each variable alone is manageable. Together they compound each year's loss building on the previous years because the upper skeleton has no mechanical input to counteract any of them. That compound is why I planted the wall push at the beginning and end of every workday, not as exercise, as mechanical input to a skeletal territory that receives no other input throughout the day. 30 seconds in the morning when the osteoblasts are most responsive, the circadian formation peak aligning with the sclerostin suppression to produce the strongest bone-building response the timing allows. 30 seconds in the evening to extend the suppression window into the overnight resorption period. The osteoclasts that will peak between midnight and 4 meeting residual osteoblast activation that would otherwise be absent. The wall at the end of the hallway, both palms flat, 60% effort. The loading invisible to anyone walking past. The warmth in the forearms afterward, the reactive hyperemia confirming the vascular bed compressed and dilated, is the only external evidence. The internal evidence accumulates across months on a timeline too slow to feel but measurable on a DEXA scan, the distal radius T-score stabilizing instead of declining, the gap between the femoral neck and the wrist narrowing instead of widening, the half of the skeleton that was losing density in silence finally receiving the mechanical input it requires to maintain the architecture that will catch you if you fall. Anyone with diagnosed osteoporosis, recent upper limb fracture, rotator cuff repair, or active shoulder impingement should consult their physician before sustained isometric loading through the arms, both palms flat against a wall, elbows slightly bent, body leaning forward at 15 degrees. Active pushing, not leaning, not resting against the surface, but driving force into the wall as though trying to move it. 60 to 70% of maximum effort. Each arm transmits 200 to 280 newtons through the skeletal chain, metacarpals to radius and ulna, to humerus to scapula pressed against the rib cage by the serratus anterior. 60% is calibrated to the physics, not to perceived effort. It generates 1,000 to 1,500 microstrain in the cortical bone of the radius, above the osteocyte activation threshold where the mechanosensitive channels open, below the soft tissue ceiling where the tendons and joint surfaces begin taking damage. 100% effort risks the glenohumeral joint surfaces and the rotator cuff tendons. After 60, connective tissue compliance declines from collagen cross-linking, and the rotator cuff may already carry partial thickness tears from the decades of disuse. The wall push is designed to reverse. The 60% level is the mechanical sweet spot, above the bone threshold, below the tendon ceiling. Progression follows the loading physics. After 2 weeks of bilateral pushing, one arm pushing doubles the per arm force, the full body weight percentage transmitting through a single chain instead of two. The osteocytes in one arm receive twice the stimulus. After 4 weeks, increasing the lean angle from 15 degrees to 20 or 25 degrees increases the body weight percentage through the arms. Greater lean means greater compressive force, means greater bone deformation, means greater bone deformation, means greater sclerostin suppression. Each progression targets the osteocyte threshold, because bone that has been loaded for 4 weeks has a higher baseline density and requires more deformation to reach 1000 microstrain than the same bone before loading began. 30 seconds sustained. Circadian bone remodeling rewards sustained input over brief bursts. Robling's data confirmed that 30 seconds of continuous loading suppresses sclerostin more effectively than equivalent force in 5-second intervals. The minimum effective dose is not defined by how hard the push feels. It is defined by how long the osteocyte signaling cascade needs to complete. The calcium influx propagating through the canalicular network, the prostaglandin signal reaching the bone surface cells, the sclerostin gene downregulating to the level where osteoblast suppression lifts. 30 seconds provides this completion time. Shorter durations start the cascade without finishing it. Morning push when osteoblast activity peaks in the circadian cycle. The bone formation markers, osteocalcin and P1NP, reach their highest concentrations in the morning hours, reflecting peak osteoblast activity. The sclerostin suppression from the morning push arrives when the osteoblasts are most prepared to respond to it. Evening push to extend suppression into the overnight resorption window. Osteoclasts follow their own circadian rhythm with peak resorption between midnight and 4 in the morning. The residual osteoblast activation from the evening push provides the formation counterbalance during this resorption peak. After the hold, reactive hyperemia. The warmth in the forearms confirms the vascular bed compressed during the push and dilated on release. 1000 microstrain, 30 seconds against a wall. The half-walking never reached hearing the signal at last.